Hello, I'm Bernard Hickey from interest.co.nz and welcome here to another double shot interview where we speak to a CEO or a minister about what's happening in banking, financial services, the economy and economic policy. And today I've got here Miki Szikszai, who's the CEO of Snapper. Snapper is a company that has contactless payment cards in Wellington and are doing some really interesting things in the area of payment systems. And I just wanted to get Miki in to talk about how Snapper are doing and what's going to happen with payment cards over the next decade or so in New Zealand. It's a really interesting area. Miki, firstly, for those people who aren't familiar with Snapper, maybe they don't live in Wellington, tell us what the background is there and how you're doing.
Okay, great. So thanks, Bernard, for having me along. So Snapper's been in Wellington for about 2 years now. So it was launched in June 2008. The main driver behind it is Infratil. So Infratil own all of Snapper. They also own New Zealand Bus, and the idea came up because New Zealand Bus's existing ticketing equipment was starting to get to end of life. Infratil looked at that and they were just going to do a standard replacement, but then they looked at the opportunity that was out there for small value payments or micro payments and realised there's actually something bigger here than just public transport ticketing. This is really around how do you replace coins and from basically your pocket and speed up those day-to-day transactions.
Because these have been quite successful overseas. I'm thinking of the Oyster card in London, and there's some in Hong Kong too.
That's right, yeah, Octopus in Hong Kong, and those are the two of the most well-known platforms. It's really interesting understanding the differences between those as well. Oyster is all about public transport, so it's a card that can be used only on public transport, whereas Octopus is a more open platform, so that can be used for a variety of payments such as retail payments, parking, taxis and the like. So what Infratil did was they did a scan of what was out there in terms of models and technology and settled on the Korean model. So this is the technology we use in Snapper is the same technology that's used in Seoul, one of the biggest cities in the world. So it's on, I think, about 10,000 buses, 6,000 subway stations, tens of thousands of taxis. I'm
just trying to think how it works. I get my card, I load it up with some money, and then I just sort of wave it past the machine.
Exactly. So you get a card like this. So this is a special Snapper card because it's our staff IDs as well. So this particular one not only has our photo ID on it, but it also allows us to access the building. So it starts to combine some of those elements. But anyway. Process is the same. You load some money on it. You can either do that at a retailer or online with a special device, so you can effectively effect that top up from your computer. And then when you go to make a payment, for example, in a bus, you don't actually ask where you want to go anymore. You just literally hold that to a reader, tag on, and then at the end of your trip you tag off. The system calculates what the fare was and effectively deducts that from the money which is held on your card. So the thing that is different about this compared to other payment systems is the money is actually stored on the card. So there's a purse on here. So it's not having to do an online lookup back to your account. So that's why we get the speed, because you actually don't need to look up, you don't need to make an online transaction to check. It's a secure transaction on the card.
And in Wellington, you've doubled the number of cards out there and I understand tripled the number of transactions. How do you expect to grow this throughout New Zealand and in particular the big market in Auckland?
Sure. So I mean, we're a transaction platform, so volume of transactions is key for us. So we announced last year that we're moving into the Auckland market. We've executed a deal with New Zealand Bus. Around about the same time, ATA, who are the Regional Transport Authority, said that they had an arrangement with Thales to provide some back-end infrastructure and some areas on rail. It's pretty clear to us that we need to interoperate with those systems. So we're in discussions with ATA and NZTA on how we do that. Really important element to that is the development of a national standard for interoperable payments. Particularly on that small value area. So there are existing standards that exist for things like FPOS, but they don't apply right down to the public transport area. So we're helping develop those standards.
And how's New Zealand doing? We led the way on FPOS, so are we leading the way in this system as well?
Look, I think we're catching up a little bit. When you look at the use of these types of systems in places like Hong Kong and London, particularly in public transport, we have had to catch up. We've used generally pretty old relatively insecure and slow technology in the past. Starting to adopt this type of technology gets us on the same footing as the likes of Korea, which really is leading the way.
How much of the spending in Korea is done through these sorts of cards?
That's a really good question. I don't know in terms of proportion of overall spend, but what they are seeing in terms of the average spend, it's about a third retail, a third of retail small value payments are done on these types of cards. So it's big.
And how do you make money out of it?
It's transaction fees. So we charge bus operators and public transport operators a transaction fee for processing the payment. There's value in that for them. It's basically removing cash from the bus. It's making reconciliation for them easier and reporting easier. We charge retailers a transaction fee if it's used for making a payment in store, again all around convenience. And we charge a top-up fee if you're topping up the card in retail. Now that's actually, we don't really get any money out of that. That almost pretty much all goes to the retailer to effectively compensate them for the service they're providing to customers for top-up. So it's a transaction model.
And looking overseas at the transition with Oyster and Octopus, I mean, how are they going to grow over the next decade or so, and how might you see this sort of thing working in New Zealand over the next decade or so?
I think the big structural change that's happening is a lot of these systems that were closed proprietary systems are now opening up. So Oyster in particular is a great example. Because it is only used for public transport, it actually limits its utility. People are saying, surely I've got money on this, surely I can use this in my local cafe to buy a coffee or a newspaper like you can in Wellington. And so what Oyster are doing, because they're owned by Transport for London, they've decided that's actually not a business that they want to be in. So they're opening up their platform to allow contactless Visa and MasterCards to be used for public transport. So that's a big area they're driving down. So that's quite a brave move for a government entity to say, you know what, we're actually not going to control this anymore, we're going to open up to other players. They're certainly following what's happened in Salt Lake City, where that has been up and running for a couple of years now. And the MTA in New York is also going down the same path. Now, an interesting little side note, Charlie Monheim, who was my predecessor at Snapper, came from Oyster. So he basically headed up Oyster at Transport for London. So he went from Oyster to Snapper, knowing that a more open scheme needed to be developed. He's now also at MTA in New York. So there is one guy who is basically what I would characterise as a global legend who is driving a lot of this stuff. So we're fortunate enough to be able to inherit some of his expertise.
And how are the banks coping here in New Zealand or becoming involved?
Look, the banks are interested. They're interested for a couple of reasons. Utility is one. So one of the things that we see ourselves being able to do is to start to combine these cards with the new smart cards that banks are going to be issuing over the next year or two. So the banks are all moving away from the magnetic stripe card to smart cards for fraud and security reasons. It's pretty clear they would be able to integrate a Snapper type application on those cards, so a co-issuing type of thing. So they're interested in those types of things. They're also, to be frank, really interested at looking at how they can charge transaction fees in retail environments where they haven't done that directly to retail. I mean, it's the way FPOS works at the moment. The cardholder pays the transaction fees in retail as opposed to the retailer. And whereas you compare, that's for a debit transaction compared to a credit card transaction where the retailers are charged. So they're looking at this going, maybe there's an angle in here for us to change some of our business model. So they're watching the model with interest. We're very well linked with ANZ National. I mean, they're key. They're a really important launch partner for us, same as FPOS New Zealand. We use their switch for switching our retail transactions. So they're very interested in opening up the platforms there. And
just finally, on the issue of laundering and of fraud and of privacy, how do you address those concerns?
Two ways. Legislation is one. So we're covered by the anti-money laundering legislation. So, for example, on these cards, there's a limit of $300 that can be loaded on the card. So, effectively, it's a natural barrier for laundering. Fraud is really important from a security perspective. I mean, we've got what we think is the most secure system that exists out there in the world today. We know for sure that can only last for so long, so you've basically got to keep up to date with the latest security technologies. But at the moment, we're more secure than anything else that's out there.
And privacy in terms of all that information?
Yeah, privacy we're really strong on. It's quite interesting. We've conversations with transport operators where they say they own the data, and we go, no, and they think we're about to say we own the data, but we don't own the data. Cardholders own the data. So our view is that the cardholders give us permission to use that data explicitly, and then we can use that. If they don't, then we don't use it.
Excellent. Hey, thank you very much. Miki from Snapper, the CEO of Snapper. That was a double shot interview. I'm Bernard Hickey from interest.co.nz.